This is my true story. Every Christmas, my son and I shared the same tradition: dinner, laughter, a quiet drink by the fire. And every year, he would ask me one strange question: "Do you still forgive him, Dad?" I never knew who he meant, but I always said yes. I thought it was a child's memory of something I once mentioned. But this Christmas, his answer changed everything I believed about my family, my marriage, and even myself. What he told me that night made me drop my glass and lose my breath. Before I tell you, please comment where you're watching from and subscribe so my story can reach more people. Every Christmas night, after the food was eaten and the fire began to fade, my son would lean back in his chair, look at me, and ask the same quiet question: "Do you still forgive him, Dad?" It started when he was a teenager. I thought it was just curiosity, some moral lesson he wanted to hear repeated each year. I would smile, pat his shoulder, and say, "Yes, son, I always forgive." That became our strange little ritual. No matter what the year brought, sickness, loss, or distance, that one question never changed. At first, it felt almost comforting, like a father-son secret that only we shared. Every time he asked, I thought maybe he admired the idea of forgiveness. Maybe he was trying to learn something from me about patience or love. I never asked who him was because I assumed it didn't matter. It could have been about an old friend, a neighbor, someone who wronged me long ago. I'd lived long enough to forgive many people, and it never occurred to me that the person he spoke of might still matter. The question became part of Christmas itself. After dinner, I'd pour him a glass of wine, and he'd sit quietly for a while before asking. Then I'd answer, and he'd nod, and we'd move on. Year after year, the same rhythm. It didn't seem strange until the tone of his voice began to change. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was heavier, slower. Sometimes he'd look down as he asked, like he was carrying something he didn't know how to put into words. I brushed it off every time. I thought maybe he was dealing with his own mistakes. Maybe it was his way of asking if forgiveness was possible for him too. He had his own troubles, his own regrets. I thought that's what it was. I was wrong. This year, as I waited for him to ask, I realized how much older we'd both become. His hair had streaks of gray now, and his eyes looked tired in a way that went deeper than age. But still, he smiled and helped me set the table, the same way he always did. He poured the wine this time, like he wanted to take care of me for once. When dessert was done and the plates were cleared, he sat quietly again. The room was warm, the lights soft, the house filled with that heavy peace only Christmas night can bring. I waited for the question, even before he spoke. I could almost hear it before the words came. It wasn't just a question anymore. It had become the bridge between us, the last piece of tradition we still shared. So when he asked, "Do you still forgive him, Dad?" I smiled like I always did and answered without hesitation. But something in his eyes this time felt different, as if this year the answer actually mattered more than ever. I didn't know that the question I had been answering for decades was not about some distant person from my past. I didn't know that the story behind it was part of my own family, buried deep beneath lies and silence. I thought I was teaching my son about kindness, but all along, he was preparing me for a truth I never expected to hear. That Christmas, the question was the same, but what followed was not. It would be the night everything changed, the night I finally learned who him truly was. The night forgiveness stopped being an easy word and became the hardest thing I had ever tried to give. For years, that question lived quietly in the background of my life. Every time my son asked it, I felt a small flicker of confusion, but I buried it quickly under love and routine. I told myself that some questions didn't need answers, especially when they came from family. He was my boy. I trusted his heart, even when I didn't understand his words. But as the years passed, the question began to echo in my mind long after Christmas had ended. I started replaying the moments after each holiday. The way his tone changed, the way his hands fidgeted before asking. It wasn't just a question of curiosity anymore. It felt heavy, almost painful. I began to wonder if he was testing me. Maybe he was asking if forgiveness had limits, if there were things a man should never forgive. Or maybe, I thought, He was trying to tell me something without saying it. But what could it be? Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake replaying old memories. I thought about the people who had wronged me, business partners who stole from me, friends who turned their backs when I was struggling. Maybe my son remembered one of those stories. Maybe him was just one of those ghosts from my past. That seemed like the simplest answer, and I clung to it. I told myself not to dig into it. Some memories are best left buried. But still, I couldn't stop wondering why it mattered so much to him. He had his own life, his own family. He didn't talk much about his mother, and I didn't force the topic. She had left when he was young. No warning, no explanation. I raised him alone, worked double shifts, made sure he had everything he needed. Every Christmas was my proof that we had made it through. That was why I never wanted to break the tradition. It reminded me that somehow we still had each other. Still, every time he asked the question, something inside me tensed, a quiet ache, like a wound that had never fully healed. I didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I blamed myself for his mother leaving. I thought he might be asking about her. Maybe he thought I held resentment against the man she left with. That seemed possible. But I didn't want to bring her up. He had finally found peace after so many years. Why reopen the wound? That was how I justified the silence. That was how I convinced myself not to ask who him was. I thought I was protecting him, giving him space. But now, I see it differently. I was avoiding the truth. I was afraid of what he might say if I asked directly. The confusion grew stronger with each passing year. My son grew older, quieter, more careful with his words. He always visited on Christmas but rarely called during the year. When I asked how he was doing, he'd smile and say good. But there was something hollow in that word, something unsaid. Sometimes, I caught him watching me closely when he thought I wasn't looking. The way you look at someone when you're studying their reaction, waiting for the right moment to reveal something heavy. And every time, right after that look, came the same question. Do you still forgive him? I didn't realize it then, but that question wasn't about forgiveness at all. It was about truth. A truth he had been carrying for years, waiting for the right time to share. And all that confusion I'd ignored was about to turn into something far deeper, far more painful than I could have imagined. This year, I would finally get my answer. And once I did, I would understand why he had been asking me that question for so long. But by then, it would be too late to stop the hurt that came with it. Time moved quietly, the way it does when you're too tired to notice it. The house changed, seasons changed, but the question stayed. Every Christmas, after the tree lights dimmed and the dishes were washed, my son would ask that same thing. Do you still forgive him, Dad? The years between those questions became a blur of work, survival, and loneliness. The silence his mother left behind never really left the house. It filled every corner, every conversation we didn't have. I watched him grow into a man. He finished school, got a job, built a life of his own. I should have been proud. And I was, but there was always something distant in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something heavier, like guilt. He'd call me every few weeks, but his voice always sounded careful, measured, as if he was guarding a secret he couldn't let slip. There were moments when I thought about asking him directly. Who do you mean, son? Who is the man you keep talking about? But every time I looked at his face, I stopped myself. He looked so much like his mother. The same smile, the same way of holding pain behind kindness. I didn't want to stir old ghosts. I told myself the past was gone, that forgiveness was a choice I'd already made. I spent years convincing myself that I had done the right thing by never asking too much. Parents make that mistake sometimes. We believe silence protects our children, when really it only builds walls between us. I thought he was just trying to learn from my example. I had told him stories about forgiving people who wronged me, co-workers, neighbors, even relatives. Maybe he was remembering one of those. Maybe he admired the idea of a man who could forgive and move on. That's what I told myself. But as time went on, I started noticing little things that didn't fit. He never brought up his mother, not even once. When her name accidentally slipped into conversation, he'd change the subject. I thought it was grief, but it was more than that. There was something inside him that tightened at the sound of her name, like a knot he refused to untie. The years turned him into a quiet man. He worked long hours, never married, never mentioned anyone special. Every Christmas he showed up at my door with the same warm smile and the same wrapped gift. Always something simple, thoughtful, something that said he still cared. But behind that smile, I could see it. That unspoken question burning inside him long before he said it out loud again. Sometimes after he left, I'd sit in the empty living room and stare at the photos on the wall. His mother's picture was still there, even though I hadn't looked at it properly in decades. I used to wonder if he resented me for keeping her memory alive. Maybe he blamed me for her leaving. Maybe that's what the question was about. Maybe him was me. That thought haunted me for a long time. What if the person he wanted me to forgive wasn't a stranger, but myself? What if I had failed in some way I couldn't even remember? But no matter how much I searched through the memories, I found nothing except love. I had done everything I could to keep us together. I never stopped being his father, never stopped trying to be good enough. Yet as the years went by, that single question grew heavier. It followed me like a shadow, a quiet reminder that there were still truths I didn't know. I thought I could carry that mystery forever, but time has a way of forcing answers when you least expect them. And this year, the answer would finally come. Not in anger, not in shouting, but in a few quiet words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life, my wife, and my son. Christmas became the only day that truly felt alive in my house. The rest of the year was quiet, slow, almost empty. But every December, the sound of my son's footsteps returned warmth to the walls. We had our traditions, simple, familiar, the kind that gave structure to time. I'd roast the same meal, light the same old decorations, play the same soft songs that used to fill the house when his mother was still around. It was all I knew how to do to keep things feeling normal. He always arrived right before dinner. He'd bring a small gift, sometimes a book, sometimes a sweater. Nothing fancy, but thoughtful. We'd sit together, eat slowly, and talk about work, weather, and old memories. We never talked about her. I think we both silently agreed to leave that name buried under years of dust. The food would get cold sometimes because neither of us wanted the night to end too soon. After the meal, we'd pour a drink, turn off the TV, and sit by the small tree in the corner of the living room. The lights blinked weakly, the same ones I'd used since he was a child. Every Christmas ended the same way. Me in my chair, him on the couch, both of us holding glasses, both waiting for that one question to surface. It always came at the same moment, like it was rehearsed by time itself. He'd pause, look down at his hands, then raise his eyes to me and ask, "Do you still forgive him, Dad?" I would smile, even though my chest always tightened when I heard it. The words were so gentle, but they carried something heavy underneath. I'd always say the same thing. "Yes, son. I forgive him." I never asked who him was. I never wanted to ruin the peace of the evening. Whatever that question meant, it felt like it was holding us together somehow. It became a rhythm we both depended on. Maybe he asked it to remember his mother. Maybe he asked it to test my heart. Maybe he just needed to hear that forgiveness still existed somewhere in the world. I didn't know. I only knew that it mattered to him. When he left each year, I'd clean the plates, wash the glasses, and sit by the window for a while. The lights from the street would fade, and the house would fall back into silence. But my mind would linger on that one question. Every year it seemed to echo louder. Sometimes I'd whisper the words to myself, "I forgive him." I didn't even know who I was forgiving anymore. It had become habit, like breathing. Maybe that's why I never pressed for answers. It was easier to live with mystery than risk reopening wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. I thought I was being wise by keeping peace. I thought forgiveness was enough. I didn't know that the truth had been waiting behind those words all along. The routine felt safe. It gave me purpose. It made Christmas bearable. But deep down, something inside me always stirred when I looked at my son's face after I answered him. There was sadness there, Not for me, but for himself. I thought maybe he regretted something he'd said to his mother before she left, or maybe he blamed himself for the family we lost. I wanted to tell him that none of it was his fault, but I didn't. The silence between us was fragile, and I was afraid that honesty might break it forever. I didn't know that one small question, repeated year after year, was not about reflection. It was about confession. And this Christmas, he would finally stop asking and start telling. And when he did, the world I had built on forgiveness would crumble in a single moment. That Christmas night felt different before it even began. The air in the house was colder than usual, even with the fire burning. I had set the table the same way as always. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 1 small candle in the center. The smell of roasted meat filled the room, but I couldn't taste anything. Something in my chest felt heavy, like I was waiting for a storm I couldn't see. When my son arrived, he was quiet. He hugged me, but it wasn't the warm kind of hug we used to share. It felt distant, almost forced. We sat and ate in silence. He picked at his food, asked a few polite questions, but his eyes kept wandering. To the photos on the wall, to the floor, to the clock. He seemed nervous, as if the room itself was pressing down on him. I tried to lighten the mood, told an old story from when he was a boy. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something trapped behind that expression, something that wanted to come out but couldn't. I poured him a drink. He refused the first time, then changed his mind and took it. He drank it fast, too fast. That was when I knew something was wrong. My son was not a drinker. He never needed alcohol to speak his mind. That night, though, he was drinking like a man trying to build courage. After dinner, I suggested moving to the living room. We carried our glasses, and I turned on the tree lights. They flickered weakly, casting soft colors on the walls. The same small decorations we'd used for years still hung there, faded, old, full of memories. He sat on the couch, staring at the floor, while I settled into my chair. The silence stretched between us like a wall neither of us wanted to break. Then I felt it, that familiar shift in the air. The same moment that always came before the question. I didn't even need to look up. I could feel his eyes on me. I took a slow sip, waiting for it. The tradition would continue, I thought. He would ask, I would answer, and we would end the night like we always did. Quiet, peaceful, incomplete. But this time, something was different in his voice when he finally spoke. It was lower, softer, like he was afraid of his own words. "Dad," he said, "can I ask you something?" I nodded, even though my heart had already started to beat faster. I didn't know why, but I could sense that this time, the question would mean something else. Something final. He didn't ask right away. He looked at his hands, rubbed them together, took another breath. The room felt smaller, tighter. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. It had never sounded so loud before. Finally, he spoke. The same words, the same question he had asked every Christmas for decades. "Do you still forgive him, Dad?" I smiled faintly, though it felt forced. My throat was dry. "Yes, son," I said quietly. "I forgive him." The words came out the same way they always did, calm, almost automatic. But as soon as I said them, I noticed tears forming in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the tree lights, blinking fast, trying to hold himself together. Something inside me knew that this would not end the same way as before. The air had changed. The way he held his breath after my answer told me this time was different. He wasn't asking out of habit. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was asking because he needed to tell me the truth. I could feel it coming, like the moment before a dam breaks. All those years of confusion, of silence, of pretending not to wonder. It was all leading to this night. I didn't know what his next words would be, but I knew they would change everything. I looked at him, my only son, the one piece of family I had left, and waited. And when he finally opened his mouth again, the truth he spoke would tear open every wound I thought had healed long ago. He sat there for a long time before he finally spoke again. I could see his hands shaking, his lips pressed tight as if holding back something heavy. The lights from the tree flickered across his face, and for the first time in years, I noticed how much older he looked. His shoulders were tense, his eyes red, like he'd been fighting tears long before he walked through my door. I didn't move. I just waited, afraid that if I said anything, he would stop before telling me what I'd been needing to hear for decades. "Dad," he said softly, his voice breaking a little. "Do you still forgive him?" The words were the same as always, but they didn't sound like they used to. There was pain in them. Fear. Guilt. It wasn't just a question anymore. It was a confession trying to find its way out. I felt my heart slow down. I nodded, almost out of habit, trying to keep the moment steady. "Yes, son," I whispered. "I forgive him." But something in his eyes told me that this time, my answer wasn't enough. He didn't look relieved like he usually did. He didn't nod and smile. He didn't even look at me. His hands clenched tighter, and his whole body trembled like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. I asked gently, "Son, who is it you mean?" The room felt colder suddenly, and he looked up at me with eyes that no longer carried the innocence I remembered. They carried truth, the kind that hurts. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Dad," he said, "you should know who I meant all these years." I frowned, confused, but I didn't speak. I waited for him to go on. He swallowed hard and then whispered, "I was talking about the man Mom ran away with. The one she said destroyed our family." He paused, his voice shaking. "You always said you forgave him. I needed to hear it because—" He stopped again. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise I'd ever known. I could feel something rising in my chest, an ache I couldn't name. I looked at him, waiting for the rest. My glass was still in my hand, untouched, my fingers trembling around it. He looked straight at me, and then, with a voice that barely held together, he said the words that would shatter everything I believed. "Because he was my real father." For a second, I didn't understand what I had just heard. My mind refused to accept it. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to tell me I misunderstood. But he didn't. He just looked down, ashamed, broken, as if those words had been waiting inside him for years. The room spun. My hand went numb. The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the house like thunder. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. Every memory of raising him, his first steps, his first bike, the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, flashed through my mind all at once. Every moment of love suddenly twisted into confusion. He kept talking, but I couldn't hear half of it. My ears rang, my eyes blurred. He said he had found letters, ones his mother had written to that man. He said she had confessed everything before she died, that the man I had forgiven, the one I thought stole my wife, was the one who had given her the son I raised as my own. I sat there, frozen, staring at him, unable to speak. The world felt like it was crumbling inside my chest. He reached out as if to comfort me, but I couldn't move. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was empty, completely, quietly empty. That question, the one he asked every Christmas, wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about truth. He had been asking if I could forgive the man who had given him life, the man I never knew had already taken mine apart piece by piece, and I had said yes, every year, without knowing what I was forgiving, without knowing who. The air in the room felt heavy after his words. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of the clock, the faint crackle from the fireplace. But it all sounded distant, like I was underwater. My son, or the boy I thought was my son, sat there shaking, whispering words I could barely process. "She told me before she died," he said. "She said she couldn't leave the world with that secret." I tried to look at him, but every time my eyes met his, I saw her face. I saw the woman I loved, the woman I forgave. And now I realized what I had really forgiven all along. Her betrayal, her lie, her silence. I felt my chest tighten, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I stood up slowly, not sure if I was standing to walk or just to survive. My legs trembled. The pieces of the broken glass were scattered near my feet, and I stared at them like they were pieces of my life. He kept talking, voice trembling, trying to explain things that didn't need explanation anymore. He told me he had found letters she wrote to the man years ago, letters she never sent. He told me about the photos she had hidden, the one where the man held her hand while she was pregnant. He told me how she said she stayed with me because I was kind, because I was stable, because she knew I'd never hurt him. He told me she had written that I was the better man, but none of it made the truth easier to bear. I sat down again, my body weak. I looked around the room, the Christmas tree, the old decorations, the photo of me holding him as a baby on the wall. I had spent my whole life believing I was his father. I taught him to walk, to speak, to ride a bike. I stayed up when he was sick. I cried when he graduated. I carried him through every storm. And yet, in that single moment, I felt like a stranger in my own story. He reached across the table, his hand shaking. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. "I needed to tell you. I needed you to know the truth." His voice cracked on the last word. I could see guilt eating away at him. I wanted to hate him for bringing it to me, but I couldn't. None of it was his fault. He had lived his whole life carrying someone else's lie. I wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I felt everything at once: rage, sadness, pity, confusion. But mostly, I felt tired. Tired of forgiving. Tired of being the man who always held pain quietly. I thought about every Christmas before this one. Every time he asked that question. He wasn't asking about some distant man I had forgotten. He was asking about himself. He needed to know if I could forgive the truth of his existence. And every year, I said yes, without even knowing it. The realization hit hard. All those years, he had been living in silence, wondering if I'd still love him if I knew. All those years, I had been loving him without knowing who he really was. And somehow, that made it all more painful, not less. Because I did love him, I still did. Nothing could erase that. I looked at him finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're still my son," I said. The words felt strange leaving my mouth, like they were coming from someone else. He broke down then, tears, shaking, years of guilt spilling out at once. But I didn't move to comfort him. I couldn't. Not yet. The truth had freed him, but it had imprisoned me. I felt like my entire life had been rewritten in a single night, every memory recolored by betrayal. Yet, deep down, beneath the pain, there was still love, bruised, but alive. And maybe that was the cruelest part of it all. I had spent a lifetime forgiving what I didn't know. Now, I would have to learn to forgive what I did. For a long moment after his confession, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and steady, marking each second of silence like a reminder that life still moved, even when hearts stopped. My son, or the boy I raised as one, sat across from me with tears running down his face, his hands gripping his knees, afraid to look up. I stared at the floor, the shards of glass still scattered where they had fallen. The sound of the shattering echoed inside my head again and again. It was as if that was the exact sound of my world breaking. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words were trapped behind a wall of shock. I tried to speak, but my voice came out dry and cracked. I didn't even recognize it. I asked him when he found out, though I already knew it didn't matter. The truth was out, and no amount of detail could soften it. He told me his mother confessed everything before she passed, how she had loved another man before marrying me, how that man had left, how she hid the truth out of shame and fear, how she let me believe the child she carried was mine because she couldn't bear to lose both love and security. Each word dug deeper into my chest. I remembered every moment she had looked me in the eye and said she loved me, every time she said I was a good father, every Christmas, every birthday, every "I love you" from my son, now tainted, uncertain. The years I spent working late, saving money, planning a better life for my family, they all flashed through my mind, but now they felt like someone else's story. My son kept apologizing, but I could barely hear him. His voice was faint, fading behind the roaring in my ears. My hands shook as I reached for the photograph on the table, me, her, and him when he was little. The picture looked happy, real, and maybe it was. Maybe love doesn't disappear just because truth is ugly. Maybe I had been a father in every way that mattered. But at that moment, I couldn't see it that way. I saw only betrayal, twice over. He came closer, sat on his knees beside me, and grabbed my hand. "You are still my father," he said. I looked at him, and for a second, I saw the little boy who once held my hand at the park, who cried when he scraped his knee, who ran into my arms every time he was afraid. That image hurt more than anything. I wanted to pull him close, to tell him everything was fine, but my body wouldn't move. My throat tightened, my vision blurred. The air in the room felt heavy. I whispered, "I raised you. I loved you." That was enough. He broke down completely then, his head against my arm, sobbing like a child. I let him cry. My heart hurt for him, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort him. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was supposed to feel. Was I a father betrayed, or just a man who loved too blindly? Minutes passed like hours. When he finally stood, his face was red, his eyes swollen. "I just wanted you to know," he said. I couldn't keep lying. I nodded, but the gesture felt empty. He gathered his coat, said he would come back tomorrow, but I didn't answer. I just sat there, staring at the mess on the floor. After he left, the silence wrapped around me again. I looked at the empty chair, the flickering tree lights, the half-empty bottle of wine. Christmas had always been a day for forgiveness, but this one demanded something greater than forgiveness. It demanded strength. I thought of my wife, wherever she was, and wondered if she ever felt the weight of what she did. I thought of my son, now wandering out there in the cold, carrying guilt he didn't deserve to carry alone. Then I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but not from anger, from loss. From the realization that everything I had built had crumbled, yet one thing remained. I still loved that boy. Not by blood, not by truth, but by years. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and whispered to myself, "He may not be my son by birth, but he will always be my son by heart." The glass was gone, the lies were gone, but love, broken, bruised, silent, still lived somewhere inside me. When the door closed behind him, the house fell silent. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it seeps into your bones. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair where he had just been. The lights on the Christmas tree blinked softly, their glow flickering across the broken glass still scattered on the floor. Each reflection reminded me of something shattered. The truth, the trust, the illusion I had called my life. My heart felt heavier than it ever had, but it wasn't just from betrayal. It was from the sudden emptiness that replaced everything I thought I knew. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I could still hear his voice echoing in my head. He was my real father. The words kept looping, each time cutting deeper. I thought about his childhood, about all the times I stayed up late comforting him after nightmares, teaching him lessons, guiding him through heartbreaks. I remembered his laughter as a boy, the pride I felt when he called me Dad. Now, even that word felt foreign. My chest tightened as I wondered, was any of it real? Or had I been living someone else's story all these years? The memories wouldn't stop coming. The day he was born, I remembered holding him in my arms while she smiled, tired but glowing. I remembered his first steps, his first school play, the first time he fell off his bike and cried into my shirt. All those moments flashed before me like scenes from a life that suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. I felt my throat close up. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was the weight of knowing I had built my world on something that was never true. I stood up slowly, my knees shaking, and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. Snow was falling softly, covering the ground in white, peaceful, untouched. I watched it fall and thought about how something so cold could look so beautiful. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. old, tired, and broken. I barely recognized the man looking back. I whispered to myself, "What now?" But the silence gave no answer. The room still smelled like Christmas dinner, turkey, spices, and red wine. But it all made me feel sick now. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and stared at the empty doorway. My son had walked through it so many times over the years, carrying gifts, smiles, and now, truth. The kind of truth that doesn't heal. I took a sip, my hands trembling. The liquid burned going down, but I barely felt it. My heart hurt more. I sat again, the loneliness sinking deeper. I thought of my wife, the woman who had held my hand through life, who had smiled across this same table, who had carried a secret so big it destroyed everything we built. I wondered what she thought in her final moments. Did she regret it? Did she think of me? Or did she leave the world believing I'd never find out? The anger I felt toward her flickered, then faded into exhaustion. I couldn't even hate her. I had loved her too long. As the hours passed, the room grew darker. The tree lights were the only thing glowing now. I sat in that dim light, surrounded by ghosts of memories that no longer felt like mine. I felt the weight of time pressing down. Years of sacrifice, years of lies, years of love that no one asked for but I gave freely anyway. My hands covered my face, and for the first time in many years, I cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady tears that fell onto my hands and stayed there. The collapse didn't come like thunder. It came like snow, slow, silent, but heavy enough to bury everything underneath. That night, something in me broke for good. Not my faith, not my hope. Those had gone long ago. What broke was the part of me that still believed love could fix everything. Because sometimes, love isn't enough. Sometimes, truth is the only thing left standing after everything else has fallen apart. Morning came slowly. I hadn't slept. The fire had gone cold hours ago, but I stayed in the same chair, staring at the empty wine glass and the shards I hadn't bothered to clean. The light from the window crept across the floor, touching everything but me. My head felt heavy, my chest hollow. The world outside moved on, cars passing, children playing in the distance. But inside, time had stopped. I was somewhere between heartbreak and acceptance, not sure which one would win. I looked around the room. The photos on the wall, the decorations my wife used to hang, the ornaments our son had made when he was little. They all told the same lie, but I couldn't bring myself to take them down. Because even if the truth had broken me, the memories were still mine. Maybe not real in the way I once thought, but real in how they made me feel. Love doesn't vanish just because it was built on someone else's mistake. It lingers, stubborn and quiet, refusing to die even when everything else does. I stood slowly and picked up the broken pieces of glass from the floor. My hands trembled, not from age, but from exhaustion. Each piece caught a bit of morning light, like small reminders that even broken things could still reflect something beautiful. I threw them away one by one, breathing heavier each time. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, just how I felt inside. I thought about calling him. I wanted to tell him to come back, to talk again, to eat the leftovers still sitting in the kitchen. But I stopped myself. He needed space, and so did I. We both had to process what had been lost, and what still remained. Because no matter what blood said, I had been his father all those years. I had raised him, taught him, loved him. Nothing could rewrite that. As I sipped the coffee, I looked at the chair where he had sat the night before. I could still see the fear in his eyes, the guilt in his voice. He had carried that secret like a stone for years, too afraid to let it drop. I realized then that he had suffered too. He had lived his entire life trying to reconcile two truths: the father who raised him and the man who gave him life. That wasn't his fault. That wasn't something a child should ever have to carry. So I made a decision. I would not hate his mother. I would not blame him. I would not drown in what could not be changed. I had spent my life forgiving things I never understood. Now I would forgive what I did, because forgiveness was all I had left. Not as a gift to them, but as a way to survive myself. I went to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept old letters. Inside was one from my wife, written years before she died. It was short, almost careless. But reading it now, I saw the cracks between the lines. "You were always the kind one," she had written. "Maybe one day you'll understand why I stayed." At that moment, I did. She had loved me in her own broken way. Not enough to tell the truth, but enough to stay when she could have left. That realization didn't fix anything, but it softened the ache just enough to breathe again. Later that day, I cleaned the table, took down the decorations, and sat by the window as the snow began to fall again. The world outside looked pure and white, untouched by lies or pain. I thought about the next Christmas, whether my son would come, whether we'd sit at that table again. I didn't know, but I hoped he would. Not because I needed to forgive him, but because I needed him to know he was already forgiven. As night fell, I turned off the lights and looked at the reflection in the window. An old man, tired but still standing. I whispered to myself, "Some truths break you, but they also free you." And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. I didn't have a wife anymore. I didn't have certainty. But I still had love, quiet, painful, enduring love. And that was enough to keep me alive.